4,000 warships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, and for exactly 11 seconds, Commander Vexter Olsen believed this would be the easiest campaign of her 300-year career. Then she saw the single ship waiting for her. Not a fleet, not a defense line, not even a distress beacon calling for reinforcements that would never come. Just one battered, gray-hulled vessel, sitting motionless at the edge of human space, as if it had been expecting her. Vexter had commanded the Coalition's Third Dominion fleet for 40 years. She had watched 11 species kneel before the sight of her ships alone. The sheer, overwhelming mathematics of 4,000 hulls arranged in a formation so vast it blotted out 3 moons. Species that had spent generations preparing their surrender speeches the moment Coalition sensors registered their star system. It was not cruelty. It was efficiency. Nobody fought battles they had already lost. So when the bridge of her flagship, the Esker Dominion, filled with a tactical display of a single unidentified vessel loitering directly in the fleet's path, her first assumption was equipment failure. "Confirm sensor readings," she said. "Confirm, Commander." Her tactical officer, a sharp-eyed Threll named Doskovan, did not look up from his console. One ship, human registry markings, designation, patrol class decommissioned model, weapon signature is minimal. It should not be capable of threatening a single frigate, let alone this fleet. Then why is it here? Nobody answered because nobody knew. The Coalition's diplomatic protocol had governed first contact for 600 years, refined across 100 conquered worlds and inherited by every species that joined its ranks. Announce presence, demand acknowledgement, offer terms, allow the target civilization exactly one response cycle before force became the answer. It was elegant. It was fair by the Coalition's own definition of fairness. And it had never once failed to produce a reaction. Fear, defiance, desperate pleading, something. The message went out on all frequencies, translated into English by the fleet's linguistic array. Coalition forces have entered your territory under the authority of the Unified Accord. Acknowledge receipt and prepare to receive terms. Silence. Vexter felt something she had not felt in decades. The faint, cold prickle of not understanding what was happening. "Resend the message," she ordered. "Increase signal strength. Perhaps their receivers are damaged." They resent it. Then again. Then a fourth time. Each transmission met with the same absolute, unbothered silence in the small gray ship sitting at the mouth of human space, like a locked door. Doskovan's voice had lost its usual confidence. "Commander, the vessel isn't jamming us. It's receiving the message. Its systems confirm receipt every time. It is choosing not to respond. Choosing." That single word unsettled Vexter more than any weapon reading could have. In 600 years, no species, not the proud, not the desperate, not even the ones who fought to the last ship, had ever simply ignored a Coalition's opening transmission. It was not part of any playbook she had ever studied. She stood from her command chair and walked toward the viewport, staring at the tactical projection of that one small ship, dwarfed by 4,000 warships arranged behind her like a wall of judgment. It should have looked absurd, a gnat facing down a mountain. Instead, something about its stillness made the hair on her arms rise. "Run a deep scan," she said quietly. "I want to know everything about that vessel before we proceed." The results came back within minutes, and they told her almost nothing useful. The ship was old, decades past its intended service life, according to its hull signature. Its weapons were minimal, its shields unremarkable, its engines nothing extraordinary. By every metric the Coalition used to measure threat, it registered as functionally harmless, and yet it had not moved. It had not fled. It had not called for help. It simply waited exactly where it was for her. "Commander," Doskovan said carefully, "orders?" Vexter considered the protocols that had guided her entire career. Protocols built on the assumption that every species, when faced with overwhelming force, would react the way overwhelming force was supposed to make them react. Fear, compliance, desperation. This ship offered none of those things. It offered nothing at all, and that nothing was louder than any warning shot could have been. "Advance the fleet," she said finally. "Formation Gamma. If they will not answer diplomacy, we will remind them why diplomacy exists. 4,000 ships began to move. The small gray vessel did not retreat an inch. As the armada closed the distance, Vexthera found herself staring at the ship's designation, translated crudely from a human transmission signature, Relentless. She did not know yet that the name was not a boast. It was a warning she had already failed to heed. Because somewhere in a mountain of ignored, unprocessed, low-priority transmissions the Coalition's automated systems had filtered out over the past several months, humanity had already tried to tell her exactly what would happen if the fleet came anyway. Nobody on the Ishkar Dominion had read those messages. They were about to learn why that had been a mistake. The tension on the bridge of the Ishkar Dominion had a texture now, thick enough that Vexthera could feel it pressing against her chest as the fleet closed to engagement range. 4,000 warships arranged themselves into Formation Gamma, a pattern of overlapping fire zones and coordinated shield walls that had crushed rebellions on 23 worlds. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. Formation Gamma existed to communicate one single fact to anyone watching. Resistance was mathematically impossible. The Relentless did not reposition. It did not raise shields to detectable levels. It simply sat there, engines idling, as the wall of Coalition steel arranged itself around it like a fist closing slowly around a single grain of sand. Final transmission window, Vexthera announced, her voice carrying across the bridge. Human vessel, this is your last opportunity to acknowledge Coalition authority before force is applied. The response, when it finally came, was not what anyone expected. A voice, calm, unhurried, almost bored, crackled through every channel simultaneously, bypassing the fleet's translation protocols entirely, speaking in perfect, unaccented Coalition standard. You already had your answer. You just weren't listening. Then the channel went dead. Vexthera's blood ran cold, not from the words themselves, but from the technical impossibility behind them. Coalition standard was a closely guarded diplomatic language, encrypted and restricted to command-level fleet communications. A single decommissioned patrol ship should not have been able to access it, let alone broadcast across her entire command network without triggering a single security alert. Doskovan explained that. Commander, I don't know how they did that. Our systems show no intrusion, no breach. It's as if they were simply already inside our network. His hands moved rapidly across his console, sweat beating at his temple, despite the ship's climate control. Recommend immediate defensive protocols. Do it. But it was already too late. The first sign of trouble was an explosion. It was silence, the sudden, disorienting absence of the constant chatter between the fleet's 4,000 vessels, the coordination signals that kept Formation Gamma functioning as a single, unified organism instead of 4,000 separate ships adrift in the dark. Communications are down across the fleet, Doskovan said, his voice rising in pitch. Not jammed, not destroyed, redirected. Every coordination signal is being rerouted through unknown relay points. How is that possible? That ship doesn't have the processing power to. It's not the ship, Commander. A new voice, the fleet systems analyst, cut in from her station, pale-faced and staring at cascading error messages. It's already inside. It's inside our command architecture for. She checked the timestamp and went even paler. 6 days. 6 days. Vexthera felt the floor of her certainty crack open beneath her. 6 days meant the Relentless had breached Coalition fleet systems before the Armada had even entered human territory. It meant every tactical decision she had made since departure, every course correction, every formation adjustment, every private command briefing had potentially been observed. Bring up defensive countermeasures. Full firewall protocol, immediate. The lights on the bridge flickered, and half the tactical displays went dark simultaneously. Across the fleet, the first confused reports began arriving, ships losing contact with their neighbors. Formation Gamma's carefully overlapping shield coverage collapsing into gaps as vessels lost the coordination data that told them where to position themselves. It wasn't chaos yet. The Coalition's individual ship crews were disciplined enough to fall back on independent protocols, but the unity that made 4,000 ships more dangerous than 4,000 separate threats was unraveling, thread by thread, faster than anyone could stop it. Weapons fire detected. Doskovan reported suddenly. Single source. The Relentless. Vexthera turned to the viewport in time to see it. A single, precise beam of energy lancing out from the small gray ship, not toward any hull, not toward any crew compartment, but directly into the sensor array of the nearest Coalition cruiser. The Velkus Farron, a ship Vexthera had personally commissioned 8 years ago, went dark in an instant, not destroyed, but blinded, deaf, and drifting. "They're not attacking to kill," Daskovin said, disbelief thick in his voice. "They're attacking to disable." "That's worse," Vexthera said quietly, and she meant it. A fleet that fought back could be predicted. A fleet that tried to kill you followed patterns rooted in the desire to survive. But an enemy who dismantled you piece by piece, methodically, without any apparent urgency or fear, was playing a game whose rules Vexthera did not yet understand. And every second she spent trying to understand them was a second the Relentless used to carve another piece out of her armada. "All ships, independent defensive protocol," she ordered, forcing steadiness into her voice that she did not entirely feel. "Concentrate fire on the target. I want that ship destroyed within the next 10 minutes. The order went out. 4,000 ships, no longer able to coordinate as one, began turning their weapons independently toward a single, small, gray vessel that had not fired a single shot meant to kill. It was the first mistake of many, because the Relentless had been waiting for exactly this moment. The moment the Coalition stopped moving as one disciplined fleet and started moving as 4,000 separate, uncoordinated targets, each one now vulnerable in ways Formation Gamma had been specifically designed to prevent. Vexthera did not know it yet, but the battle had already been decided. She was simply the last person on the bridge to realize it. 10 minutes. That was all the time Vexthera had given her fleet to destroy a single ship. 40 minutes later, the Relentless was still there, and the Coalition fleet no longer resembled an armada at all. "Report." Vexthera snapped, gripping the edge of her command console so tightly her knuckles had turned pale beneath her gray skin. "We've lost coherent contact with roughly 600 vessels," Daskovin said, and the number hung in the air like a physical weight. "Not destroyed, Commander. Blinded. Their sensor arrays are down. Their targeting systems are down. Their communication relays are down. They're combat capable in theory, but they can't see anything to shoot at, and they can't hear anyone telling them where to go. 600 ships. From one vessel. It gets worse." Daskovin pulled up a new display, his hands unsteady. Formation Gamma's central weakness. The one flaw in the pattern that our own tactical review board flagged 11 years ago and dismissed as statistically irrelevant. That's exactly where they're concentrating their efforts. Every disabled ship is positioned precisely where it does the most damage to our overlapping coverage. It's not random. It's not even opportunistic. It's like they had the schematics for Formation Gamma before they ever saw us deploy it. Vexthera felt ice spreading through her chest. That's classified. That flaw was buried in an internal review that never left Coalition Command. "I know, Commander." The bridge fell into a silence heavier than any before it, because everyone present understood the implication at the same time. Somehow, some way, the Relentless, or whoever stood behind it, had known about Formation Gamma's single structural weakness before the fleet had ever engaged. That was not battlefield improvisation. That was preparation. Deep, patient, months in advance preparation. Pull up every transmission log between the Coalition and human territory going back 1 year. Vexthera ordered abruptly. Everything. Every ignored hail. Every unread diplomatic packet. Every automated dismissal our systems logged as low priority. Daskovin hesitated. "Commander, that's several 100,000 individual transmissions. It will take." "Do it. Now." While the search ran, the battle continued its slow, grinding humiliation. The Relentless moved to fracture remains of Formation Gamma, like a blade through fabric already torn, never lingering in one position long enough to draw a concentrated fire, never repeating a pattern twice, striking sensor arrays and communication relays with a precision that felt less like combat and more like surgery. Ship after Coalition ship went dark, not dead, but deaf and blind, drifting uselessly in a battle they could no longer perceive. Casualties began mounting not from enemy fire, but from Coalition ships colliding with each other in confusion, or firing wildly at friendly vessels their blinded systems misidentified as hostile. The Relentless had not needed to kill anyone. The Coalition fleet was doing that to itself. Commander, the systems analyst's voice cracked with something between disbelief and dread. I have the search results. The display filled with transmission logs, thousands upon thousands of them, spanning 11 months, all originating from human territory, all addressed Coalition Command, and every single one of them tagged with the same automated status: low priority, unverified source, and no action required. Vextra opened one at random. It was dated 8 months earlier, a formal diplomatic communication requesting direct dialogue regarding Coalition fleet movements near human border systems. It had never been read by a living officer. It had been auto-filtered by a classification algorithm that deemed human transmissions insufficiently formatted to merit review, because humanity had not yet been formally inducted into the Coalition's diplomatic registry, and unregistered species communications were, by long-standing policy, treated as noise. She opened another, and another, warning after warning, request after request, growing steadily more direct in tone as the months passed, each one buried under the same dismissive tag, each one completely unread by anyone with the authority to act on it. The final message in the log, dated 3 weeks before the fleet's departure, was different from the rest. Shorter, colder. If the Coalition enters human space with hostile intent after this many attempted contact, we will respond with the minimum force necessary to make our position understood. This is not a threat. This is a courtesy you have not extended to us. Vextra stared at the screen for a long moment, the sounds of her collapsing fleet fading into a strange, distant hum around her. Commander? Doskovin's voice seemed to come from very far away. Orders. She looked up at the tactical display, at the 600, now 700, disabled Coalition ships drifting through the wreckage of formation that had never once failed her in 40 years of service, all of it undone by a single vessel that had tried, again and again, to warn her this was coming. Open a direct channel to the Relentless, she said quietly. It's time we listen. The channel connected. And for the first time since the fleet's arrival, Vextra found herself looking at a face rather than a wall of silence. The man on the screen looked unremarkable in almost every way. Middle-aged, weathered, wearing a faded uniform that bore the insignia of a service branch decades out of fashion. He sat in a command chair that looked older than some of the officers on Vextra's own bridge, in a cockpit whose control panels showed the unmistakable were genuine age rather than deliberate design. Commander Vextra Olsen. His voice was calm, even mild, carrying none of the triumph she might have expected from someone who had just crippled 700 ships without losing a single crew member. I was starting to think you'd let this go on until there was nothing left to talk to. Who are you? Captain Owen Lark, formerly of the 3rd Colonial Defense Wing, currently in command of a ship most of my superiors assumed would never fly again. Vextra glanced at the tactical display, at the continuing slow bleed of disabled Coalition vessels, and forced her voice into something resembling steadiness. Your ship has caused catastrophic damage to a Coalition fleet operating under lawful diplomatic authority. With respect, Commander, you brought 4,000 warships to a system that had spent 11 months trying to talk to you. Lark's expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes sharpened. We sent formal requests through every channel your protocols listed as valid. We escalated when we got no response. We warned you, specifically and repeatedly, what would happen if you arrived with hostile intent instead of an open channel. You did anyway. Our systems classified those transmissions as unverified. Humanity was not yet a registered Coalition-adjacent species. The dismissal was procedural, not personal. I understand that. Lark leaned forward slightly. That's exactly the problem. You have a system so large and so confident in its own procedures that it can ignore a civilization trying to prevent a war, simply because that civilization hadn't filled out the correct paperwork yet. That's not a flaw in humanity. Commander, that's a flaw in you. Vextra wanted to argue. Every instinct built by 3 centuries of Coalition service told her to assert authority, to remind this captain of one broken-down ship exactly how small his position truly was. But the wreckage drifting silently across her tactical display made the argument feel increasingly difficult to voice with any conviction. You could have destroyed my fleet, she said instead. Your ship has demonstrated capabilities we cannot explain, weapons that disable without killing. access to our command network that should have been impossible. And yet 700 ships remain intact, merely blinded. Why? For the first time, something like genuine weariness crossed Lark's face. Because this was never supposed to be a war, Commander. It was supposed to be a conversation you refused to have any other way. We didn't want to kill your people. We wanted you to understand, immediately and unmistakably, that humanity is not a species you can arrive at an armada and expect to fold quietly. By sending one ship against 4,000, by sending the right ship against 4,000, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his mouth. You should ask your intelligence division what the relentless actually is. Commander, I think you'll find the answer more informative than anything I could tell you myself. The channel cut, not with hostility, but with the same unhurried calm that had characterized every moment of the engagement. Vexthera turned to her systems analyst, dread coiling tighter in her chest with every second. Pull full registry data on the vessel designated Relentless. Full history. Everything. It took less than a minute for the answer to appear, and when it did, the bridge went utterly silent. The Relentless was not a warship. It had never been one, not in any meaningful sense. Commissioned nearly 60 years earlier as a border patrol vessel, it served 2 decades of unremarkable duty before being decommissioned and transferred to a planetary history museum, where it spent the last 30 years as a static exhibit, a monument to humanity's early efforts at self-defense, visited by school children and veterans, its weapons system stripped down to non-functional replicas for public safety. That's impossible, Doskovan said, staring at the display. A museum piece did this? To an active coalition fleet. Vexthera said nothing, because the horror settling into her chest wasn't disbelief. It was a sudden, sickening arithmetic of what this meant. If a decommissioned 30-year retired museum vessel, restored hastily and crewed for a single demonstration, could disable 700 active coalition warships without losing a single life, the question was no longer whether humanity could defend itself. The question was what humanity's actual military was capable of, if this was merely the message they'd sent with a relic. Vexthera stood alone in her ready room for the first time since the engagement began, staring at the tactical display projected above her desk, a graveyard map of 740 coalition vessels drifting dark and blind across a battlespace that had once been the largest, most confident deployment of her career. Not one crew member dead, not one hull destroyed beyond repair. Every single disabled ship could, in time, be recovered, repaired, and returned to service. That fact bothered her more than total annihilation would have. A door chimed, and Doskovan entered without waiting for permission, his usual composure entirely gone. Commander, Coalition Command is demanding a full report. They're calling it the worst tactical humiliation in Coalition military history. They're not wrong. There's something else. He set a data slate on her desk, his hand trembling slightly. Our analyst finished a deeper review of the Relentless combat data. Commander, the tactics that ship used, the systematic disabling, the exploitation of formation gamma structural weakness, the precision targeting of communication and sensor arrays instead of hulls, none of that is standard human military doctrine from any database we have access to. Meaning whoever crewed that ship wasn't executing existing tactics. They were executing something new, something built specifically to counter us, to counter coalition formations, coalition protocols, coalition assumptions about how warfare works. He hesitated. Commander, I don't think this was improvised. I think humanity has spent years studying us, specifically in anticipation of exactly this scenario. Vexthera closed her eyes. The pieces had been assembling themselves in her mind since Lark's transmission, and Doskovan's report simply confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Humanity had not stumbled into victory through desperation or luck. They had anticipated the coalition's arrival, studied its tactics, identified its structural weaknesses, and prepared a demonstration precise enough to cripple an armada without triggering an actual war, because a war was never the goal. The goal was a message, delivered with just enough force to be unmistakable, and just enough restraint to leave room for a different outcome than mutual destruction. They had chosen a museum ship specifically, because a museum ship could send that message loudly. If a retired vessel with replica weapons could accomplish this much, what exactly did their active fleet look like? The comm chimed. "Commander, Captain Lark is requesting to reopen the channel. He says it's time to finish the conversation." Vexthera straightened her uniform, though there was no one aboard the Relentless to see it, and nodded. "Put him through." Lark's face reappeared on the display, and this time there was no calculated calm in his expression, only tired, plain honesty. "Commander, I imagine you had time to think. You could have told us all of this in a single transmission a year ago." "We tried, Commander," repeatedly, through channels your own protocols designated as valid. Every message was returned unread, or simply never returned at all. Lark's voice carried no anger, only a weariness that felt older than his years. "We didn't want this outcome. My government spent months debating whether a demonstration like this was even necessary, whether there was some other way to make the Coalition understand that humanity would not be dictated to. In the end, we concluded that a fleet as large as yours, built on a doctrine of intimidation, would only respect a message it couldn't dismiss. And if I had ordered my fleet to fire with lethal intent from the very beginning, for the first time, something harder entered Lark's expression. Then the Relentless wasn't going to be the only ship humanity had waiting. "Commander." It was simply the first. The words settled over the bridge like a physical weight, and Vexthera understood, with sudden and total clarity, that everything she had witnessed, the silence, the precision, the restraint, had been a controlled variable in a demonstration humanity had never actually needed to escalate further. They had wanted her fleet crippled, humiliated, and largely alive, specifically so she would carry this understanding back to Coalition command intact. "What do you want from us now?" she asked quietly. "The same thing we wanted a year ago," Lark said. "A conversation. One where humanity isn't filed under unverified source, no action required. One where the next fleet that visits our territory does. So because we invited it, not because your command decided we needed to be reminded of our place." Vexthera looked past the screen, at the drifting wreckage of her once invincible armada, and felt the last of her certainty about the Coalition's place in the galaxy quietly, permanently dissolve. "I'll carry that message myself," she said, "personally." The Eshkur Dominion limped back into Coalition space 3 weeks later, escorting the battered remains of a fleet that had left as the largest military deployment in a generation and returned as a cautionary tale. Coalition Command convened an emergency session within hours of the fleet's arrival, and Vexthera stood before the assembled council, representatives of 11 member species, each one accustomed to the comfortable certainty that Coalition military dominance was simply an unchallenged fact of galactic life, and delivered a report that unmade that certainty in real time. 740 ships disabled, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of every word. 0 Coalition fatalities. 0 human casualties. The engagement was conducted entirely by a single vessel, decommissioned decades ago and restored specifically for this demonstration, crewed by a fraction of the personnel a comparable Coalition warship would require. A ripple of disbelief moved through the council chamber, exactly as she had expected. What she said next silenced it entirely. This was not humanity's military response to our arrival. It was their opening statement. They deliberately selected the least capable ship in their possible arsenal, used it to systematically dismantle our fleet's coordination and cripple our formation without lethal force, and did so specifically to demonstrate restraint alongside capability. They wanted us to understand precisely how much damage they were willing not to do. And their actual military capacity? One counselor asked, his voice tight. "Unknown," Vexthera admitted, which is, I believe, exactly the point they intended to make. She presented the transmission logs next. The 11 months of ignored diplomatic outreach, the repeated warnings dismissed by an automated system too confident in its own procedures to recognize a civilization trying, in good faith, to prevent exactly a catastrophe that had ultimately unfolded. The chamber's mood shifted from disbelief to something closer to shame as counselor after counselor recognized their own bureaucracies reflected in the failure. The mistake was never underestimating their weapons, Vexthera said, closing her report. It was underestimating their patience, their preparation, and their willingness to demonstrate restraint even after we gave them every reason not to. We arrived expecting to remind humanity of its place in the galaxy. Instead, They reminded us that dominance built on intimidation eventually meets someone who refuses to be intimidated, and that when it does, the outcome depends entirely on whether that someone chooses mercy. In the months that followed, the story of the Relentless spread far beyond Coalition command, retold and reshaped across a dozen species networks until it became less a military report and more a piece of galactic legend. The tale of 4,000 warships humbled by one old ship that never needed to fire a killing shot to make its point. Humanity, for its part, made no further demonstrations. Captain Owen Lark returned to relative obscurity. The Relentless was quietly restored to its place in the Planetary Museum, weapon systems once again stripped to inert replicas, a small placard added beneath its display noting simply, recommissioned for a single mission, 2247. Return to service as a reminder that peace is always the first offer. Commander Vextra Olsen requested and received a transfer to the newly formed Coalition Human Relations Division, a posting many of her former colleagues considered a demotion. She did not see it that way. She had spent 40 years believing the size of a fleet determined the outcome of any conflict, and one old ship had taught her, in a single afternoon, that the deciding factor had never been the size of the weapon. It had been whether anyone bothered to listen before reaching for one. Years later, when new species petitioned for entry into the Coalition and asked what had truly changed after the incident at the edge of human space, the answer given most often by those who had been there was not about the battle itself, nor the ship, nor even the staggering asymmetry between 4,000 warships and one. It was this: an entire armada had arrived certain it understood exactly what it was dealing with. By the end, it understood that it hadn't been listening at all, and somewhere in the vast, quiet dark of human space, an old museum ship sat waiting, a monument not to victory, but to the cost of being heard too late.